today we are going to learn how to squat. So the first thing that we're going to check is we're going to check do we actually have the mobility required to perform a squat. So what we're going to do is we're just simply going to do a bodyweight squat, right? The bodyweight squat is going to let us see if we have the mobility required at our ankle, hip and knee, and then alongside that we can use a weight out in front of our body to use as a counterbalance, which is also going to allow us to see how this movement looks when it's loaded. What we're going to do just to get into our squat stance is get your feet just slightly outside the hips. Your toes don't necessarily have to be pointed straight forward. You can angle them slightly outwards, whatever is going to be most comfortable for you. From here, what I'm going to get you to do is going to get you to put your hands out in front for a little bit of a counterbalance, then take a big deep breath in, and then just slowly try to drop the hips down as far as you can. And as you're going into this bottom position, what you really want to focus on is keeping your eyes dead straight ahead, not looking down, not looking up, just keeping your eyes level and trying to keep your chest in the exact same position. Not thinking about keeping your chest up, not thinking about keeping your chest down, just thinking about keeping it in neutral. The only thing that are really moving here is just your hips as they sink down and your knees traveling forward. So after you assess how your squat looks with just your body weight, what you can do now is actually see how it looks when it's loaded, because that's how we're going to be training it, right? We're going to have a bar in our back, but the first thing we're going to do is going to see what it looks like with the weight out in front. So a lot of people find this quite useful to see if they actually have the ability to hit the required depth to actually get the hip crease below the top of the knee. So just pick a 10 kilo plate, put it out in front of you, and what you're going to do here is kind of take a big deep breath in, into your squat stance again, and just dropping down into the bottom of the squat, holding the torso position, go as low as you can, and once you get into this end range position, you'll probably know, okay, this is as deep as I can realistically get into this position. If you're noticing that you can't actually get into that bottom position, here are some things that you can troubleshoot to fix it. So the first thing that we're going to do is we're going to lie down on our back. So what you want to do once we're on the ground is we want to think about lifting our knee up as close to our chest as possible without having our lower back coming arching off the ground or lifting our glutes off the ground too much. So from here, what I'm going to do is just bring my knee up, and that's about the end range of my hip flexion at this position. Now, as you can see here, I've got pretty much 90 degrees of hip flexion, but I want to get a little bit deeper because I want to get this knee over the top of this hip crease. So what I can do is I can bring the knee back up, I could drop it out, and now I can see, okay, can I drive that knee up any further? I can get a little bit more range here. Can I go out a little bit further into a little bit more abduction? I can bring the knee up again. And now in that position, that seems to be where I'm able to get the most amount of hip flexion. Now we can do the exact same on this side. Bring the knee up. Again, it seems as if that my leg is actually just running into my hip bone here. So what I can do, bring the knee out, drop it out into abduction, drive the knee up a little bit more, and get a little bit more hip flexion here. Out again, drive it up again, and now that's probably at the most amount of hip flexion that I can get in this position. If I drop my knee out to the very side, what you'll see is that I can't really get much more hip flexion at all, and it seems as if I'm running into the same issue as I am here. Now, this is going to vary person to person because we all have different shaped hips, so this is why it's very important for you to do this drill. If you found that on the counterbalance squat, as well as on the just bodyweight squat, that you weren't able to get the hip crease below the top of the knee. The setup for our squat is extremely important because it's going to really dictate how the set starts. So we want to walk through all the different points within our squat setup to ensure that we're maximizing performance and that we're individualizing the setup to ourselves. So the first thing that we want to start off with is to adjust these J hooks. So ideally, we're going to have the bar set so it's around upper chest to clavicle height. Any lower, it's going to be too low. We're going to be essentially starting off the movement with a bit of a squat. And if it's up too high, we're going to have the calf raise the bar out of the rack. Now, if you're in a position where you're using racks like this and you find yourself to be in between two heights where one is just a little bit too high and the other one's just a little bit too low, I'd always recommend going for the rack like that is a little bit too low because it's going to be safer. You have to think when you're actually going to re-rack a bar and you're under fatigue and you've pushed the set hard, what's going to be easiest to do? Just to fall into the rack or to tippy toe and calf raise the bar back into the rack? I'd probably pick just falling in. Now that we have the J hook set up, we're going to bring the bar up, and now you can see just as I have this bar set up, it is exactly where I want it to be. So it's between the clavicle or my collarbone and around my upper chest. So after you've got the bar height correct, the next thing we want to do is adjust our grip. Depending on how wide your shoulders are or the mobility that you have within your shoulders is going to dictate how close you can get your hands in. Ideally, we want to get our hands in as close as we can because it's going to allow us to create the best shelf and our traps, so the bar can sit there, as well as just a lot of tightness through the lats. Because what we're trying to do when we get the bar onto our back, we're trying to externally rotate our arms into this position here, so we can start to crank down on our lats and contract them and engage them, because they're going to be adding a lot of stability to the actual torso itself. You'll see when I actually set my grip, especially when I go into a low bar position, I'm thinking about using these rings to guide where my fingers are going to be placed, so I have the same grip set every single time. So with this here, I'm going to bring my thumbs over. So I specifically like to have my thumbs over just because it feels a lot more comfortable for me, and I don't necessarily have the mobility to wrap my thumbs around the bar. From here, you'll see where the bar is placed on my hand just before I set up underneath, okay? The bar is sitting on the flesh of my palm, and the reason for this being is as I'm trying to wedge myself under, as I get myself underneath the bar now will rest on the flesh versus in my fingers. So if the bar is resting too far up in the hand throughout the set, what's going to happen is your wrist is going to go back into extension, and this is where a lot of people complain about their wrist getting quite sore during a squat. It's because they have the bar set too high up in the hand. Going to get into our grip, bar on the flesh of our palm, and now from here, I'm thinking about pulling myself underneath the bar and thinking about wedging my foot into the ground. So I'm going with front foot first, and then I'm bringing the second foot underneath. You can see here, I'm not fully upright. There's a bit of a bend in my knee. My hips are a little bit bent too. But then from here, what I'm thinking about is I'm thinking about scooping my hips under, and as soon as I scoop my hips under and extend my knees, the bar will pop straight out of the rack. You might notice here, I'm putting my elbows down as far as I can. This essentially is to just ensure that I have my back as tight as possible. So the position of the bar at our back is actually really important for both exactly where we want to hit within the actual squat itself, whether we want to be more hip dominant or knee dominant, but also in regards to the stability of the bar on the back. A lot of people will complain about having like neck pain when they are doing the squat, or they'll complain about maybe their bones hurting, and a lot of times it's from now from not actually kind of setting up the shelf effectively. So what we want to think about when we are actually getting ourselves underneath the bar is you want to think about kind of retracting and pulling down our shoulder blades. So as we retract and pull them down, we're going to be able to kind of bring a lot of the muscle mass that's in the kind of mid back and upper back together to provide a nice place for this bar to sit on. Because when this bar is loaded, it is a metal rod and it's going to be loaded with iron, and it's going to not feel too comfortable if it is just resting on bone. So we want to be using the padding that we have. We want to use the muscle in our back for the bar to sit on effectively. And once that is placed there on that nice little kind of shelf there, which you're creating your traps in your upper back, as you do that, alongside having the strong grip of the bar in your back, and you're kind of wedging yourself into that position, the bar should feel nice and solid and stable, and it should feel as if it's unlikely to move unless you just decide to let go of the bar. Now that we've went through the bar position in the rack, we've went through our hand position, we've went through setting the bar on our back and creating that shelf, we went over the wedge, we're now going to go through the unrack as well as the walkout. What we're going to do, get ourselves positioned, get our grip set, is as I bring in this front foot here, I'm trying to apply pressure downwards, which is allowing me to feel solid underneath the bar. Now from here, what I want to think about is I'm going to just extend the knees, extend the hips, and what I want to think about doing is my walkout in no more than 3 steps. So I'm going to take 1 foot back to find my distance, 1 foot to find the width, and then the 3rd foot to adjust. Now I should be in my squat stance, I should feel comfortable, and from here I'm going to take my breath in to brace, some things that you want to think about when it does come to your walkout is you want to minimize the amount of energy that you're expending when you're actually performing a walkout, which is why I recommend a 3-step one. Now you could do a 2-step walkout, which just means that you're going to have to find both the distance and the width within 2 steps, and you have minimal room for adjustments. But this can be quite handy if you are using something like a competition style rack, which are not too wide. However, if you're using something like this, so a commercial gym rack, you're probably going to need to take the 3-step walkout, because that initial step gives you a little bit of an opportunity to ensure that you're not swaying the bar or windmilling the bar too much that it's going to clip off the rack and unsettle you. And then finally with the walkout, you want to ensure that you're only taking as many steps back as you need and not taking so much that you're pretty much walking halfway across the gym. Once you've unracked the bar, we really need to think about how are we breathing and how are we bracing, before we drop into the bottom of the squat and start our descent. When we're bracing for our squat, it's really important that we're actually initiating the process properly, because what can happen is that people feel as if they are bracing, but they're actually just kind of maybe breathing into their chest, for example, okay? When it does come to actually setting our brace, what we're really thinking about doing is we're trying to make this section here, our midsection, our core, our obliques, our back, as solid as possible, because they are essentially allowing us to transmit force from the ground through our hips into the bar that's on our back. So if this area here is all loose, it's unlikely that we're going to be able to feel strong out of that bottom position, because that's when we're really going to feel whether we are braced or not braced. So a common mistake you'll see beginners make when it does come to setting a brace is they'll think about breathing into their chest. And as they breathe into their chest, what happens here then is they end up creating a lot of extension through their lower back. Now, why this can be a little bit of an issue is, well, first of all, you haven't braced properly because you haven't filled up this area of air, you filled up this area of air. But then secondly, once you're into this position here where you actually have an extension through the lower back, is as you come down into the squat now, it's very difficult for you to actually hit depth without your pelvis having to roll under and tuck under. Now, when I'm doing this with body weight, it's not really that much of an issue, but when I'm doing it under load, that's when maybe problems can start to occur. What we want to think about when we're setting our brace, and this is such a simple cue and it's been a game changer for me, is when you are unracking the bar, what I want you to do is I want you to exhale. I want you to take a small exhale, and what this essentially is going to do, it's going to draw your ribs down, and it's going to bring them a little bit more kind of in line with your hips. Now, what we're doing here is as we breathe out, our obliques, our transverse abdominis, which is a huge wall of abdominal muscle that's underneath the six-pack, they are starting to contract. Now, once they're contracted, now we have this space where we're able to kind of take in another breath through our mouth to actually fill up that area and expand it out with air. So you want to think about as if this is like a canister, and we're taking the air in to kind of put pressure in the canister and expand it outwards. And this here is creating forces inside of our trunk that are pushing downwards and outwards against the wall of our muscle. So when we get into our position, as I said, we're thinking about breathing out. This is going to draw our ribs down. Then from here, once I feel that area starting to contract after taking the breath out, I'm going to then take a breath in, fill the air into this area, and as I do it, I'm going to feel as if this air becomes rock solid. And from here, this whole area here, it's going to be in neutral. It's going to be in a great position for me to just drop down into the bottom of the squat, hit that easily, and the only thing that really has changed here is my hip and my knee, which is exactly what we want. We don't want, when we're really extended through here, we don't really have a great brace, and now we're having to move through multiple different joints to get ourselves into that bottom position, as well as feel weaker there. So I'm going to show a demonstration now with the bar. So first off, we're going to show a demonstration of what it could look like if you think too much about keeping your chest up and breathing into your chest when you're trying to set your brace. Oh, that felt terrible. Did that look shit? It looked pretty ugly. And then I'm going to do an example of what it looks like when you actually brace properly and stack your ribs over your pelvis as we should be. So now that we've went through our brace on the descent, the next thing you want to think about is our foot pressure. Our foot pressure is actually really important, because our foot is our only contact point with the actual floor, and that's the place where we're actually transmitting all of our force through. So it's really important that we're thinking about how our feet are actually interacting with the ground during the squat. Now, the big things that we want to think about here is our big toe, our baby toe, and our heel. And they're essentially here as like a platform or like a tripod that's connecting us to the ground, and we're applying most of the pressure through. Now, it's quite common when people are maybe going through the descent to be thinking about keeping their knees outwards. And this is a great cue, because it allows you to actually kind of think about your hips sinking into the bottom and allowing your legs to move out of the way to make room for your hips as they come into the bottom position so you can hit depth. However, we don't want to think about that on our way up too much, because if we think about keeping our knees out too much on the way up, what can happen for a lot of people is they actually end up caving their knees inwards because they're over biasing this external rotation of the legs. So what we want to think about, we're actually going through the ascent on the way up. We're thinking about collapsing the arch here, okay? I don't have much of an arch. So imagine as if there's a big arch here. What we want to think about is we want to actually think about collapsing this area, because what happens when we collapse this area is we flatten the foot and we actually have more or greater surface contact to the ground. So when you think about, if I'm pressing here against the ground with my hand like this can only apply so much force downwards. However, if I think about pressing down through my entire palm, I can definitely press a lot more. And it's the same concept here. As well as when we're actually going through this portion here, we're at the bottom of the squat, we're thinking about kind of collapsing our heel inwards. We're going to press down through our big toe harder, as well as we're going to bias internal rotation of the hip. So internal rotation of the hip is really, really important because it's going to dictate how much contribution we get from the adductors. So the adductors are muscles that run here from the knee into just underneath the hip to help you extend the hip, okay? Now, what internal rotation essentially looks like is, if you just look on my back leg here, you'll be able to see I'm actually able to kind of turn that outwards, okay? And that's essentially what internal rotation looks like. So it's this bone here rotating inwards, and that's essentially pulling my hips under here to extend from deep hip flexion, so the adductors are able to provide more power in the bottom of the squat. That's why actually putting more pressure through the inside of your foot or flattening the foot can be quite beneficial as you come out from the descent to the ascent and you're changing the direction. So now what we're going to do is we are going to bring all of these cues together, and I'm going to show you exactly how to perform a squat. And bear in mind, my squat is going to look slightly different to yours because my mechanics are going to be slightly different to yours. However, we're going to go through the exact same steps in the exact same order to ensure that we have the best squat possible, and then we can use that as a baseline to progress going forward. Bar is going to be setting up just beat my clavicle to my nipples. Then from here, I'm going to get my hands into position. So I'm using the rings here to guide my fingers, so I'm going to be setting the same grip every time. I'm pushing the meat of my palm into the bar so that the bar has a nice base of support to rest on, and that it's not pushing up into my fingers, which is going to make my wrists very unhappy. Then from here, bring my full foot under to start wedging myself underneath the bar. Second foot, again, finishing off the wedge. From here, I should feel like I've got so much tension that as I just extend my knees and extend my hips, the bar pops out of the rack. So from here, we're going to take our 3-step walkout. We're going to take 1 to find the distance, 1 to find the width, and then 1 to adjust. Then from here, think about pressing my big toe down through the ground. I'm also going to take a breath out to start setting my brace. So breath out, big breath in. And once you're finished, walk in, and you're done.